You probably remember the opening shot. The Mediterranean at night. A fishing boat hauling something out of the water that turns out to be a man with 2 bullet holes in his back. They get him on board, they patch him up, and when he finally wakes up, he can't tell them who he is. He doesn't know his name, doesn't know how he ended up floating in the Mediterranean with 2 bullets in him, doesn't know where he came from or where he was going or who pulled the trigger. The last several years of his life are gone. That space in his brain that's supposed to remember that stuff is locked or empty or drowned in that Mediterranean Sea. But he hasn't lost everything. Some things came through. He speaks multiple languages without remembering how he learned any of them. Wouldn't we all like to wake up with that skill? He can read a room the moment he walks into it, clocking every exit and every threat before his conscious mind catches up. When violence comes for him, his body knows what to do, even without his mind thinking it, like a reflex for self-preservation and simultaneously for darker purposes. Whatever the man used to be, the residue of it is still wired into him. He just doesn't know what he used to be. And the entire movie, and the 3 movies that follow, is one long question asked 100 different ways. Who am I? He's running, piecing it together, trying to assemble an identity out of a passport and a safety deposit box and muscle memory. The thing that makes the movie work, the thing that made it land in 2002 and still lands now, isn't the car chases or the fight scenes or Matt Damon doing his thing with a rolled-up magazine, although all of that is very cool and I would not remove a second of it from the film. It's the question underneath all of it. A man waking up inside a life that doesn't belong to him, trying to figure out who he was before the life he's living now. That's the 2002 version of the Bourne identity. Most people don't know it has an 1887 version. Welcome, Weirdos! I'm Darren Marlar, and this is a Church of the Undead episode from Weird Darkness. Here you'll find stories of the paranormal, supernatural, legends, lore, the strange and bizarre, crime, conspiracy, mysterious, macabre, unsolved, and unexplained, brought to you from a Christian perspective. I call these weekly episodes Church of the Undead because, as Romans 6:11 says, in the same way count yourselves dead to sin but alive to God in Christ Jesus. And as Ephesians 2 states, even when we were dead in our trespasses, God made us alive together with Christ. If you were dead but now you're alive, that makes you undead. If you want to join this weirdo congregation, just click that subscribe or follow button and visit us online at weirddarkness.com/church. Coming up in this episode, Robert Ludlum, the author of the novel The Bourne Identity, which later became the 2002 film, didn't make the name up. In 1887, a Rhode Island preacher named Ansel Bourne disappeared and woke up 2 months later in a Pennsylvania candy store with no idea how he got there. Now, bolt your doors, lock your windows, turn off your lights, and come with me into the weird darkness. In 1980, when Robert Ludlum sat down to write the novel The Bourne Identity that would become the movie, he didn't make up the name Bourne out of thin air. He took it from a man who actually lived, a man who actually had something like this happen to him. Not in the Mediterranean, not in 2002, but in Pennsylvania in March of 1887. The man's name was also Bourne, Ansel Bourne. He was 60 years old, an itinerant evangelical preacher out of Rhode Island, and on the morning of January 17, 1887, he left his home in Coventry and headed to Providence with $551 in his pocket, intending to buy a small farm. He stopped by his nephew's store on the way. He also visited his sister. He was last seen standing on the corner of Dorrance and Broad Streets. And then he was gone. He didn't come home that night. He didn't come home the next night either. His family ran missing person notices in the newspaper asking anyone who had seen him to please get in touch. Nothing came back. Days turned into weeks. Weeks turned into 2 months. And in 1887, 2 months of silence in a missing persons case? That only means one thing. He's dead. They were preparing themselves for the news that his body had turned up somewhere along the road between Coventry and Providence. But that news never came. What came instead, on the morning of March 14, 1887, in a rented room above a small storefront on Main Street in Norristown, Pennsylvania, a man waking up and not knowing where he was. He didn't recognize the room. He didn't recognize the clothes hanging in the closet. The last thing he could remember was standing on a street corner in Providence, Rhode Island, 2 months earlier, and now he was somewhere in Pennsylvania, and the calendar on the wall said it was March? He went downstairs and knocked on the landlord's door. The landlord opened it and greeted him by name. "Good morning, Mr. Brown." And Ansel Bourne, 60 years old, evangelical preacher from Rhode Island, said, "My name isn't Brown. Where am I?" Now, during those 2 months that Ansel Bourne was running around as A.J. Brown, what was he actually doing? Well, he traveled to New York, he made his way down to Philadelphia, and then he infiltrated a CIA black site. He took out 3 operatives with a ballpoint pen and… wait, no, I'm sorry. Oh, hold on. Sorry, wrong notes. No, he ran a candy store. He sold stationery. He went to a Methodist church on Sundays. That's the real story. And Ansel Bourne's story isn't nearly as action-packed as Jason Bourne's, but it has a lot more to tell us than a Hollywood blockbuster. And that right there is the strangest part of the whole thing, because the movie is what we expect dissociation to look like. Car chases, fight scenes, the whole world reorganizing itself around a man who doesn't know who he is. The real version of this looks like nothing at all. From the outside, perfectly normal. A quiet shopkeeper in a small Pennsylvania town, polite, reliable, went to church on Sunday. Nobody who met him would have guessed that the man pouring their lemon drops into a paper sack had any idea his real name was Ansel Bourne and that he was supposed to be in Rhode Island. But Ansel Bourne, the real man, the preacher, the husband, the uncle, the man with $551 and a plan to buy a farm, was gone. Not from Pennsylvania, but from himself. The case got the attention of one of the founding figures of American psychology, a man named William James, who at the time was teaching at Harvard. James came down to study Bourne's identity personally. He put him under hypnosis, and what he found was that, under hypnosis, the A.J. Brown identity could be brought back to the surface, separate and distinct from the real Ansel Bourne identity. The two selves were sealed off from each other. Bourne knew nothing of what Brown had done. Brown knew nothing of who Bourne was. But James found something else under hypnosis. When James asked the Brown personality about the days before he arrived in Norristown, Brown described having been troubled. He couldn't name the trouble. He couldn't say what was wrong, but there was something, some unease that he carried with him into the candy store that never fully went away. And then there was this. When people in Norristown asked A.J. Brown about his background, Brown told them he was a retired professor of religion who had once owned a store in New Hampshire. Neither of those things was true for A.J. Brown or Ansel Bourne. There was no New Hampshire store. There was no professorship. The fugue self had constructed a fictional past, a whole biography, to back up a life that wasn't his, so that A.J. Brown could keep being A.J. Brown. Now, I'm not going to try to diagnose what caused the fugue. The doctors didn't know in 1887, the psychologists who came after William James didn't know, and we still don't know even now. And I'm a podcaster who took 5 years in junior college to get a total of 4 credits, which I have never used once in my life, so my thoughts on what caused the fugue wouldn't be worth the price of a sack of lemon drops in 1887. This wasn't the first time something interrupted Ansel Bourne's life. 25 years before the fugue, before the candy store, before A.J. Brown, before anyone in Rhode Island had ever heard him preach a sermon, Bourne wasn't a preacher at all. And no, he was not a CIA assassin working for Treadstone. You really need to stop going there. He was a carpenter, and the historical sources described him as a man whose mind, by the 1850s, was, quote, "under the dark and apparently unpenetrable cloud of unbelief," unquote. He hated churches. He hated ministers. He hated, in his words, professors of religion. He had decided somewhere along the way that the entire enterprise was a scam, and he wanted nothing to do with any of it. Come to think of it, that describes about 18 people that I know personally. October 28, 1857. He was walking from his home in Westerly toward town, and a thought entered his mind. Go to the meeting at the Christian chapel. We don't know where that thought came from. I would say God, but still. And by the historical record, he recoiled at the thought. His exact recorded words, his response to the suggestion that he go to church were these: "I would rather be struck deaf and dumb forever than go there." A few minutes later, he sat down by the side of the road, dizzy. Within moments, he couldn't speak, he couldn't hear, he couldn't see. They had to carry him home. A doctor came. Bourne lay on the bed completely aware of what was happening. He was aware that people were in the room and that he was being examined, but he was unable to communicate with anyone around him. His eyesight did come back the next morning, but he still couldn't hear and he still couldn't speak, so he wrote out a confession on a slate. He wrote that he believed God had struck him because of what he had said. "I would rather be struck deaf and dumb forever than go there." And he asked for that written confession to be read aloud in the very church he had refused to enter. The confession was carried to the Christian chapel. It was read aloud to the congregation, and Ansel Bourne, still deaf, still mute, was helped into the building and up to the pulpit. He stood in front of the congregation and raised his hands. And as he raised his hands, while his letter to the congregation was being read aloud by the pastor of the church, his hearing came back, and then his speech came back, and he preached his first sermon on the spot to the very people he had been hating for years. I would love to know what he preached that morning, but history has chosen not to preserve it for posterity. The next year he published a pamphlet about the whole thing. He called it Wonderful Works of God, and for the next 30 years, right up until the morning he walked out of his house in Coventry with $551 in his pocket, Ansel Bourne was an itinerant evangelical preacher. Fortunately, going deaf, mute, and blind like that has only happened once in all of history, that one time with Ansel. Except that's not really true. It's a pattern a lot older than Ansel Bourne, and I have a lot of examples. Saul of Tarsus is on the road to Damascus with letters in his hand, authorizing him to arrest Christians and drag them back to Jerusalem. He's a Pharisee. He believes he's serving God by stamping out a Christian heresy. A light from heaven knocks him off his horse, blinds him, and a voice asks him why is he persecuting Jesus, the very one he thought he was serving God by opposing. Saul gets up from the dirt, blind. He stays blind for 3 days, and when his sight comes back, he is no longer Saul. He is Paul, the apostle. You know, the guy who wrote about a third of the New Testament? Yeah, that guy. In the Old Testament, Jonah is told to go to Nineveh. He gets on a boat going the opposite direction, essentially saying, "Nope, God ain't gonna do it." So God sends a storm. The sailors throw him overboard upon finding out it's him who God's angry with. A megalodon swallows him for 3 days. That's a paraphrase. And he prays from inside the fish. Then the fish vomits him out onto the shore, and Jonah decides this time he's going to travel in the direction God told him to in the beginning. Zechariah is a priest. The angel Gabriel, same guy who later appears to Mary and says she's going to give birth to the Messiah, appears to Zechariah in the temple and tells him his wife is going to bear a son who will prepare the way for the Messiah. Despite being visited by an actual, real-life, honest-to-goodness standing right there in front of you angel with a message, Zechariah doesn't believe it. This is not an "I can't believe it's not butter" kind of moment, Zech. Not surprisingly, Gabriel doesn't take too kindly to this and strikes him mute. Zechariah stays mute for 9 months. His voice only returns once his son is born, and he writes his son's name on a tablet. John. As in John the Baptist. Nebuchadnezzar is the king of Babylon, The most powerful man on earth, and he gets puffed up about it. Wouldn't you? God has this thing about pride, though. He's not a fan. So God drives Neb out into the wilderness for 7 years where he lives like an animal, eating grass, his hair growing long and his fingernails growing like claws. He becomes a vegetarian werewolf. Again, that's a paraphrase. Until he comes to himself, humbles himself, and acknowledges that the Most High God is sovereign over the kingdoms of men. Imagine being so stubborn it took 7 years of eating nothing but salad with your chopstick claws rather than say, "Yep, I think you're right on this one, God. I don't want to be a goat anymore, and I agree that you are the goat. My bad." Paul, Jonah, Zechariah, Nebuchadnezzar, Ansel Bourne. The pattern isn't punishment. The pattern is pursuit. God will sometimes use affliction when gentler methods aren't reaching the person, and the affliction lifts the moment the person is ready to listen. Fortunately, not every conversion looks like this. Most don't. If you are a born-again Christian, you likely got there through much quieter doors. A conversation, a book, maybe a decision at a funeral or upon hearing a sermon that didn't seem like much at the time. The dramatic version, the Damascus Road version, the struck deaf and dumb in the middle of Westerly version is not the norm, it's the outlier. But it's a real outlier, and it shows up in Scripture, and it shows up in history, and it shows up just often enough that we should know it's part of the toolkit. God is not bound to gentle methods. When somebody has set themselves violently against him, he will sometimes meet that violence with the kind of interruption that ends the argument. Bourne said he would rather be struck deaf and dumb than go to church, and God took him at his word. He spent the next 30 years preaching, and then, one January morning in 1887, he walked out of his house with $551 in his pocket, headed for Providence, and that's when Bourne's second life interruption takes place. We find ourselves in Norristown, March of 1887. A.J. Brown is working behind the counter of the candy store on Main Street. People think of him as polite and reliable, pouring lemon drops into a paper sack for the Tuesday regulars. Ansel Bourne is in his fugue state, living as A.J. Brown. Nothing dramatic like when he went deaf and blind all those years earlier. He just woke up one morning and was no longer Bourne, but Brown. When we think of someone losing themselves, we think of the Matt Damon version. The Mediterranean, the bullet holes, the cinematic break with the past. We think of dramatic departures from a life. Somebody runs off, somebody disappears. From the outside, A.J. Brown looked perfectly fine. A respectable shopkeeper, an active church member, a man with a small shop and a quiet life. If you had walked into his store in February of 1887 and asked the neighbors about Mr. Brown, they would have told you he was a perfectly nice man, kept to himself, sold candy and stationery, went to the Methodist church on Sundays, never made trouble. Come to think of it, the man got a lot done in those 2 months. Ansel Bourne wakes up one morning on a street corner in Providence and is suddenly A.J. Brown. No memory of being Ansel Bourne, no business experience as Brown, no references, no contacts, no resume or CV, no plan, because it's kind of impossible to plan on having a fugue. He travels to New York, he makes his way to Pennsylvania, he shows up in a town where he doesn't know a single person, rents a room from Pinkston Earl, partitions the room with curtains, stocks the front half with candy and stationery, sets up weekly supply runs to Philadelphia, opens for business, builds a customer base, joins a Methodist church, and runs the whole operation smoothly enough that the neighbors find him entirely unremarkable. All of that with no memory whatsoever of who he actually is. Meanwhile, I keep forgetting what day it is during the week. The fugue thing is really strange. While in the fugue, he wasn't impaired in the slightest. Bourne's fugue self, Mr. Brown, was competent. Very competent. William James himself noted how prosaic and well-functioning the Brown personality was, not unnatural or eccentric, the contemporary accounts kept saying. He just showed up in Norristown and built a life the way a normal person might. And it's just a guess, but I'd wager a bucket of malt balls Ansel never once worked at a candy shop in his life, much less envisioned himself owning one. He probably didn't know a thing about confectionery. Sermons and sweets don't typically get to share the same space. Same Ansel Bourne underneath. Same temperament. Same church-going habits. Same work ethic. Just a smaller life. A man called to preach, running a quiet shop in a town where nobody knew his real self because he didn't know it either. You don't become somebody else when you're living the provisional life. You become a version of yourself that's just a little bit off, adjacent to who you were given to be, but not the same. From the outside, normal. From the inside, you might not even know what's wrong. Brown didn't. He just felt troubled, his words. His own admission to William James, and he couldn't name the trouble. He was running a perfectly normal candy store and going to a perfectly normal church, and his perfectly real, normal life was something he had no knowledge of whatsoever. Remember what Brown told the people in Norristown when they asked him about his background? He told them he was a retired professor of religion. He told them he had once owned a store in New Hampshire. Neither of those things was true, not for A.J. Brown or Ansel Bourne. He had built a fictional past, a whole biography, to back up the life he was living in Norristown, so that A.J. Brown could keep being A.J. Brown. We do this too. Not the dissociative fugue part, of course, the constructed biography part. The stories we tell ourselves and the people around us to explain why this adjacent, slightly off version of our life is actually the right version. This is a smarter career move, we might say. This is what a person my age is supposed to want, we tell ourselves. This is more responsible, we think. This is more reasonable. This is what serves my family. This is what people I respect would tell me to do. We build whole resumes of justification for lives that aren't quite ours. And the justifications aren't even necessarily wrong. The career move might be smart. The choice might be more responsible. The job might serve your family. Those aren't always lies. Sometimes they're just not the point. Brown's story about being a retired professor wasn't a crazy story. It was a perfectly plausible biography for a quiet man running a small shop. It just wasn't his biography. The constructed self doesn't lie about wild things. It lies about the things that sound reasonable. Those are the kind of lies that most people tend not to question, even about themselves. And he was doing it without even realizing he was doing it. It's hard to wrap your head around. If at this moment you're doing some quick math and wondering if I'm about to tell you you need to quit your job, stop, I'm not. The calling that we're talking about, the life that's actually yours, doesn't only mean career. It might. For some people, the question of, am I in the work I was made for, is exactly the right question. But for a lot of people, the calling you're carrying around isn't a job at all. It's something else. And the constructed biography around it covers something other than a paycheck. God calls people to a lot of things, in a lot of configurations. He calls people to vocations. He also calls people to side ministries that have nothing to do with their day job. He calls people to a posture inside the job they already have, to do that work as a specific kind of person, in a specific kind of way, for a specific kind of reason. He calls people to relationships, to seasons, to particular neighborhoods, to particular hard conversations that have been sat on for a year or 2 or 12. The question isn't, is God calling me to quit my job? The question is something more like this. Is there anything at all, that I know He's been pressing on me that I keep finding reasons not to do? That could be the job thing. It could just as easily be the conversation that you've been avoiding with your father since the Carter administration. It could be the call to start tithing that you've been arguing with for 6 months. My bride Robin likes to tell the story of how she once told God she would do anything He wanted her to do if He'd just let her know what it was. She immediately felt the word tithe in her spirit. Her reaction? No, anything but that, God, no! By the way, we do tithe now, religiously. It could be the nudge to go visit the friend who's been through a divorce or a diagnosis or a long stretch of unanswered texts. It could be the suspicion that you're supposed to be praying with your kids at night and you keep telling yourself, you'll start next week. It could be the prompting to forgive somebody you have very good reason not to forgive. We've all been there. Whatever it is, there's a story you tell yourself about why it can wait, why it's not the right moment, why somebody else can do it better, why God probably didn't mean you specifically. That is the constructed biography of the life you are living that may not be the one you are truly called to. We rationalize our decisions and current circumstances so that our current adjacent life keeps running, so that the version of you that isn't really you can keep being the version of you that isn't really you, so that your Bourne can keep living as Brown. I've thought about Brown's 2 months in Norristown a lot, probably more than is healthy, because I kind of lived a version of Brown's identity for a stretch of my life that was a whole lot longer than 2 months. Mine was closer to 2 years. Brown had the decency to wake up faster than I did. I wasn't in a literal fugue, but I was certainly in the wrong life. Years ago, I took a job that looked like a step up. I oversaw 13 radio stations across the country. I had a more prestigious title, a lot more responsibility, a bigger reach, the kind of move that everybody around me would have congratulated me on, and most of them did. And I was miserable. Not because the job was bad. The job was actually a perfectly good job. I was miserable because the job wasn't mine. I was called to entertain. And the new gig wasn't entertainment at all. The stations I oversaw were pre-programmed sermon broadcasts, a couple of weekend talk shows, same industry, radio, adjacent skill set, broadcasting, just on the other side of the business. But the work I was actually doing every day was a long way from what I was made to do. I was A.J. Brown behind a different candy counter, and I didn't even have the option to grab a licorice stick from the stock shelves. And here's the part I don't love telling you, but I'm going to tell you anyway because it's the part that matters most. My bride, Robin, the same one from the tithing story earlier, did not want me to take that job. She had reservations before I took it, and she had bigger reservations as my vertical move within the company got closer, and right before I accepted the promotion, she was very vocal about not wanting me to do it. I didn't listen. I think God was speaking to me through her, and I didn't listen because she was my wife, not a glowing, ominous, holy presence speaking in thunderous voices between lightning strikes. Spouses often act as God's messengers, and we often miss them precisely because they are spouses. Familiar, sitting across the kitchen table, easy to file as worried or not seeing the big picture. All I saw at the time was the new lines on my resume that would take me to my next bigger gig down the line. I had a constructed biography running in real time, and the voice trying to interrupt it was the woman I'd been married to for half a decade at that point, and I tuned her out. If you have somebody in your life right now who keeps saying something to you that you keep finding reasons to dismiss, please consider that you might be in my chair. The still, small voice doesn't always come from inside you. Sometimes it comes from somebody who loves you and is sitting 3 feet away. 11 years ago, I tried a little experiment just to see what would happen. A podcast about the weird and the dark. I didn't take it especially seriously. It was a side project that I almost didn't bother with, but it was a way for me to entertain during a time in my life when I wasn't doing much entertaining. I didn't think of it that way at the time, though. I just thought, hey, this might be kind of cool. That experiment became Weird Darkness, which became my whole career, which became the show you're listening to right now. The way back to the calling didn't arrive as a thunderclap. It arrived as a side project I almost didn't try. I'm not telling you this from the other side of the journey. I am still in the same fight you're in. The calling isn't a destination I've arrived at. It's a thread that I keep choosing to hold on to, sometimes with more conviction than other times. I have set it down before. I will probably set it down again in some small way the next time something respectable comes along to pull at me. Probably stroking my ego, that seems to be my Achilles heel. But the thread is still in my hand, and the one who handed it to me is still on the other end of it. Guess I could have skipped all of that and just said, yeah, I'm susceptible to a fugue identity too. We all are. Okay, back to Norristown and Mr. A.J. Brown working behind the counter in that candy store. There's that other detail William James pulled out under hypnosis. The thing Brown said about the days before he arrived in Pennsylvania. He said he had been troubled. Couldn't name the trouble, couldn't say what was wrong, but it was there, and it followed him into the candy store, and it never fully went away. Bourne's fugue self, A.J. Brown, said he'd been troubled. Bourne's unease in his real life never fully went away in his fugue life. That's true for all of us. You can construct a biography. You can rationalize a life. You can build a perfectly respectable Norristown around yourself complete with a candy store and Sunday church and weekly trips to Philadelphia. But underneath it, there's something troubled, something that won't settle. Some part of you that registers the misalignment even when your conscious mind can't name what's misaligned. That's not something wrong with you. That's the call still calling. Think of Elijah on the mountain in 1 Kings 19. He'd just won a huge battle against the prophets of Baal, and now Queen Jezebel had put a price on his head. So he's run into the wilderness and is hiding in a cave, exhausted, asking God to take his life. He tells God he's the only faithful one left. God tells him to come out of that cave and stand on the mountain. And then the wind comes, a great wind that tears the mountains apart and shatters the rocks. And the Lord is not in the wind. And after the wind, an earthquake. And the Lord is not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake, a fire. And the Lord is not in the fire. And after the fire, then he hears it. King James calls it a still, small voice. The newer translations say a low whisper or a gentle whisper or a sound of sheer silence. Either way, that's where God was. Not in the dramatic part, in a small, quiet, unmistakable signal underneath everything else. The unease in A.J. Brown wasn't the wind or the earthquake or the fire. It was the small voice underneath his life in the candy store. And he couldn't name it, but he carried it. If you're carrying something like that unease, that low-grade trouble, that sense that something in your life is just a little bit off axis, even though you can't pin down what, that's not a problem to be solved. That is a signal to be listened to. The fact that you're feeling uncomfortable is an indication that you've not gone too far off the path you were meant for. You're still close enough to it that you could be hearing God's still small voice guiding you in your next steps. If you don't feel uncomfortable right now, you're either exactly where God wants you to be, or you are so far off his intended road that you can't hear him anymore. If you're hearing that still small voice, your provisional self hasn't fully won. Your fugue is not permanent. Bourne came back, his fugue ended. On March 14, 1887, he woke up in that rented room above the candy store, and within days he was telegraphing his nephew, getting on a train, and going home to Rhode Island. He recovered his name, his memory, and his identity, Ansel Bourne. But here's what the historical record doesn't quite tell us. We don't have clear evidence that he ever went back to itinerant preaching after the fugue. He'd given that up before the fugue. That's why he was on the way to buy a farm in the first place. He'd stepped back from active itinerant ministry already. And after he was restored to himself, the records don't show him picking it back up in any sustained way. He went back to Rhode Island. He lived another 23 years. He died in 1910. But the man who had once stood up in a chapel, deaf and mute, and watched his hearing and speech come back miraculously as he raised his hands to preach his first sermon, that man, as far as the historical record knows, didn't return to that work. He recovered the identity of Ansel Bourne. We don't know that he recovered the calling. And I don't say that to indict him. I have no idea what was going on in his life between 1887 and 1910. Maybe he was carrying the call in a quieter way that didn't make it into the records. Maybe he was preaching every Sunday somewhere and we just don't have the documents. Maybe he'd already done what he was sent to do. I genuinely don't know. But the question the story leaves us with is this: what did that man have to say that the world never heard because he set the calling down? Let me personalize that for you. What do you have to say to the world that isn't being said because you're not following your calling. I'm not accusing you or trying to give you guilt. You might be in your calling, I don't know. But if you aren't, if you do have that uncomfortable feeling I mentioned earlier, what are you going to do about it? Consider this an invitation, because the fact that you're sitting there and the fact that the question is bothering you a little, that's evidence the thread hasn't been cut. The call is still calling. The unease is still doing its work. The provisional self hasn't fully won. The unease in your life, that low-grade trouble, that quiet sense that you're a little bit off axis, that isn't God's frustration with you. It's God's mercy to you. In Romans 11, the Apostle Paul writes this, "The gifts and the calling of God are irrevocable." His calling is irrevocable. He doesn't take it back. He doesn't change his mind about what he has called you to. Whatever it is that he has called you to, whether you've been carrying it faithfully or whether you set it down for a stretch or whether you've been living an entire adjacent life working at a candy store or operating a network of radio stations for the last 2 years or 20, his original calling for you is still your calling. He didn't withdraw it when you stopped following it. He didn't reassign it to somebody else. It's where he put it. So here's the invitation, not the threat, not get back in line before God breaks you. God isn't standing over your provincial life with a baseball bat. The invitation is gentler than that, but it is harder. Come back to the life you were called to. You'll remember at the top of this episode I told you that the man in the movie was named Jason Bourne. That's not quite true. His real name in the film is David Webb. Jason Bourne is the identity that was constructed for him, the cover, the operative, the man who became under training, the fugue self. David Webb is who he actually was underneath. And the man in the candy store, you'll remember, was named A.J. Brown. That isn't quite true either. His real name was Ansel Bourne. A.J. Brown was the identity that took over for 2 months, the cover, the shopkeeper, the man he became under the fugue. Ansel Bourne is who he actually was. The 2002 Bourne is a man waking up forgetting who he is. The 1887 Bourne is a man waking up to remember who he is. The 2002 Bourne is fictional. The 1887 Bourne is historical. The third Bourne is sitting in your chair. Who were you born to be? You've been living a life that may not be the one you were called to. There's another life underneath it. The one you were called to, the one that was there before the construction started, the one that's still there now, the one who handed you the calling is still on the other end of the thread. Come back to the life you were called to. Thanks for listening. If you like what you heard, share this episode with others whom you think might also like it. Maybe the person you share it with will want to join this weirdo congregation too. If you'd like a print version of this message, you can find it by following the episode link in the description or visit weirddarkness.com/church. And now that we're coming out of the dark, I'll leave you with a little light. Jeremiah 29 verse 11. "For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans for welfare and not for evil, to give you a future and a hope." And a final thought. The place God calls you to is the place where your deep gladness and the world's deep hunger meet. Frederick Buechner, Wishful Thinking. I'm Darren Marlar. Thanks for joining me, Weirdos. Until next time, Jesus loves you, and so do I. God bless.